All right, well, welcome back, and settle in, because I think that this is probably going to be the lengthiest lecture of this series, although hopefully it's going to be a lecture that you find really interesting. And what we're going to talk about is defining the problem, and this is a really important step, as I've alluded to, in the marketing research process. But before we can really talk about defining the problem, we need to first talk about defining the problem properly, because a lot of times when we're looking at a research problem, what we're really looking at are symptoms of a problem, and we're not necessarily putting in the time to figure out what the actual problem is. And I can give you a practical example, and that is, let's say that you wake up one morning and you have a sore throat and maybe a bit of a runny nose, and you're just not feeling well. You might attribute this to being sick, and rightly so, because a lot of times those are symptoms of being ill. And you might go to the doctor and find out that there is absolutely nothing wrong with you, and all they can really do is think that maybe it's viral and give you some antibiotics, and hopefully they'll solve your problem. But it might be that the problem is that you're not sick. The problem is that you have allergies, and there's something in your house or in your environment that's just making you allergic, and it's causing those symptoms to flare up. And your allergies are really what need to be treated, not this illness that you don't actually have. Well, in the world of business, this happens a lot too. A lot of times managers are looking at things like sales are down, or customer complaints are up, or maybe we're not selling through as many products as we'd like to. And those seem like problems on the surface, but a lot of times those are actually symptoms. They're actually symptoms of a deeper problem that's going on. Maybe sales are down and we're not selling through as many units because the price is too high, or because the product's not as available as it needs to be, or we're targeting the wrong market. Maybe complaints are up, not because there's anything wrong with how we're doing things, but they're up because we just put a new system into place and more complaints are reaching us, whereas before people tended to drop out of the automated system. Maybe complaints are up because we have some supplier relationships that have gone awry, and there's some parts that we have nothing to do with, but that are breaking down in our products that we're selling. Maybe our retail channel partners are not doing a good job, and they're encouraging customers to complain to us instead of them. There are all kinds of reasons that the symptoms that we see can really be signs of a deeper problem, and it's up to us as researchers when we're investigating the topic for a research project to make sure that we get down as deep as we can to try to find what the root cause of these symptoms is, rather than to try to study the symptoms themselves. As it happens, there are many high-profile cases where large organizations, unfortunately, got focused on symptoms and wound up doing research that led them to make bad decisions, and had some pretty catastrophic failures, or failed to identify problems in such a way that they really understood what was going on. I'm going to give you 3 examples of that. The first 2 are mentioned in your textbook. The third one is something that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that I think is really interesting. So case number 1 is the Pepsi challenge. And I was alive when the Pepsi challenge was going on. A lot of you guys have probably heard about it but never actually experienced it. But the Pepsi challenge is something that occurred in the late 70s and early 1980s. And just a little bit of background. So the late 70s, early 1980s, even all the way through the end of the 1980s, is a period that in advertising we often call the Cola Wars. We call it that because Pepsi and Coke were just at each other's throats trying to get market share. Pepsi and Coke are both long-running companies that have had cola products that have been competing pretty much throughout the 20th century, but Coke was always the premium brand, and Pepsi was always the lesser brand. It was the brand that you wouldn't offer to your guests if they came by your house. You would drink it in the kitchen privately where they couldn't see you. Even if you preferred it, it just wasn't a product that had a lot of mainstream appeal. Coca-Cola was the premium product. It was the one that you wanted to be associated with. So Pepsi got really savvy about their marketing and advertising in the 1970s, and they realized that people actually prefer the taste of Pepsi to Coke when there's no branding around. And they started staging this thing called the Pepsi Challenge, and they would hold the Pepsi Challenge in grocery stores or in public places, and they would film commercials about it and put them on TV. And the Pepsi Challenge always had the same thing. They would set up a booth and they would give people 2 different cups to drink out of. One had Coke, one had Pepsi, but they didn't know which was which. And they would tell which one they preferred to the person handing out the cups. And most of the time, people preferred Pepsi over Coke. And as it happened, it didn't, they were challenged, first of all, for manipulating the results or for, using subconscious cues or things like that. As it happened, no matter what permutation they used, whether they gave Coke first or Pepsi first, whether it was randomized every time, no matter what, Pepsi was always the victor in the Pepsi challenge. And Coca-Cola was aware of this because Coca-Cola themselves had replicated this research privately, and they were stunned and shocked that they were finding that people did prefer the taste of Pepsi over Coke most of the time. And when you're the premium brand and the market leader, that's really scary to hear, that the only thing that's really separating you from your competitor is not the quality or taste of your product so much as it is the perception that your product is premium, because that's a very dangerous, precarious position to be in. The Coca-Cola executives certainly didn't want to be there. And so in April, it was April 23rd of 1985, they decided to release something new. And what this was called was New Coke. Now, before I say anything else, I want you to understand that New Coke, okay, so New Coke was a new formula of Coca-Cola. It was sweeter, it was more syrupy, it tasted more like Pepsi. It was actually a little bit sweeter than Pepsi. And if you are a soda drinker, you probably know that Coke is a little bit tartar and a little bit more acidic than Pepsi. Pepsi has kind of a sweeter flavor profile, and longtime Coca-Cola drinkers often complain that Pepsi hurts their stomach or their teeth compared to Coke. I don't know. I'm a Coca-Cola drinker myself, but I don't have that strong of opinions about it. New Coke was something that was formulated out of a lot of marketing research. Often the way that this case is presented is that Coke just kind of arbitrarily decided to release a new formula. No, Coke worked really hard. They did focus groups, they did product testing, they did all kinds of research to try to figure out how they could beat Pepsi in the Pepsi Challenge. And they developed a formula that would allow them to do that, and that still tasted, like what they perceived to be Coke, but at the same time had that sweeter, syruppier flavor profile that consumers in a taste test would think was better than Pepsi. And so they announced that they were going to release it, and then they released it, and they were expecting this to just be a huge success and a huge win for Coca-Cola, and it wound up being anything but. Longtime Coca-Cola drinkers absolutely hated New Coke. And in fact, there were stories about people driving to grocery stores and buying as many cans or bottles of Coke as they could find of the old formula because they didn't want to have to suffer through the new formula, because Coke had announced that they were not making the old formula anymore. The new formula was it. Get used to it. That's where we're going. To longtime Coca-Cola drinkers, this was a huge betrayal, and they were really upset. There was a massive public outcry, and the fact of the matter was that a lot of people didn't feel like New Coke tasted like Coke at all. In fact, they felt like it was just a pale imitator of Pepsi, and they didn't want that. Well, as it happens, Coca-Cola made the wrong decision based on solving the wrong problem. They were trying really hard to find something that could taste better than Pepsi, but they were completely ignoring what makes Coca-Cola Coke, and that is there's much more to Coke than just the way the beverage tastes. Now that sounds a little counterintuitive. You would think with cola, I mean, it's all about how it tastes, right? Well, it is, but Coke has to taste like Coke, because Coke is something that people have long associations with. It's something that many people grew up drinking. They might have spent their allowance buying bottles or cans of it when they were kids. They might have been given it at special events by their parents or had it in their household. Those red cans with that special flavor have a strong association. This is something that's been validated by all kinds of different research. But basically, when people who have had a long association with Coca-Cola experience it in a lab setting, they show very highly pleasurable indications of association. And to be given Pepsi in a Coke can is, to them, it's a very negative association, because it feels like, wait a minute, I'm expecting the experience of Coke here, not the experience of something else. And in fact, it can actually make them feel negative feelings and betrayed and upset. And that's exactly what was going on with New Coke. Coca-Cola Company had to take New Coke off the market eventually. They started by adding in a new product line that they called Coca-Cola Classic, which was the original formula, and then they quietly phased New Coke out over a few years. Nobody really liked it, so it wasn't that hard to get rid of it. But the lesson that they learned was very important, that Coca-Cola is about much, much more than just that secret recipe that they use, that they claim only 2 people know, although that's actually not true. But it's about much more than that. It's about the experience of the brand and the positive associations that are going on. And trying to replace it with a new product was absolutely the wrong call. And no matter what research they did to support that, that research was solving the wrong problem. Well, let's think about a company that's really strongly associated with Coke, and that's McDonald's. And I know a lot about McDonald's. I know a lot about Coke and McDonald's because I grew up in a house that drank Coke, and I always found Coke really fascinating. And McDonald's was my first job. So when I was a high school student, I worked at the local McDonald's where I grew up. And I was actually working at McDonald's when this next case happened, so I know a lot about it. And that case was the McDonald's Arch Deluxe. So McDonald's in the 1990s was really struggling because they were conducting research and they were finding that many people were no longer associating them with being a place where adults would want to go to get a meal. What they were associating them with was Happy Meals and Chicken McNuggets and tiny little hamburgers and things like that. And McDonald's was losing market share, or at least they weren't growing as quickly as they had become accustomed to, I should say. And some of the areas where they were surrendering some market share were to competitors like Burger King. And Burger King had a big advantage over McDonald's because they offered a more premium hamburger called a Whopper. And it was just more premium because it was larger, it was a little bit more geared at adult tastes. It wasn't, you know, something you would find in a Happy Meal. It was something that was made a little for people that were a little bit older. And McDonald's was just really bothered by allowing one of their strongest competitors to start taking market share from them over something that they could solve with a product. So they, again, after extensive market research, they went back to their test kitchen, which is up in the Chicago area, and they challenged one of their chefs to come up with a new sandwich that could compete with the Whopper. And what he came up with was this thing called the Arch Deluxe. And the Arch Deluxe on the surface sounds actually like a pretty good idea, because what it was is it was a premium burger that was on a bakery bun, and it had you know, quality ingredients. It had a special sauce. It had a round circle of bacon. It had you know, premium lettuce and tomato on it. It was intended to be something that was for grown-up tastes. And in fact, the advertising campaign that they used even had Ronald McDonald dressed in a suit, you know, sitting at a businessman's desk with his feet up on the desk. You know, you could see his clown shoes, you know, saying, McDonald's is grown up, you know, we're now catering to grown-up tastes, and they use more modern typography and fonts. And you can see in the picture here on the slides, they have a picture of a Ronald McDonald dressed in a businessman's suit eating a burger, you know, an Arch Deluxe burger at the press conference. McDonald's was trying really hard to find a way to get adults to like their brand. Unfortunately, the Arch Deluxe was not that well liked of a sandwich. It wasn't that it was a bad sandwich. It wasn't that people were really rating it on whether it was a good or a bad sandwich. It really had more to do with the fact that people weren't going to McDonald's for that kind of food. As it turned out, the reason people were going to McDonald's was for a few reasons. One, they were going there for chicken nuggets and Happy Meals, and they were very happy to do so. They were also going there for breakfast, or, you know, just for quick snack kind of food. They were also going there for cheap food. McDonald's was pretty cheap, and remains one of the cheapest places to get a meal. And so people weren't so concerned about the quality as they were about the speed and the value of the food that they were getting. So the Arch Deluxe went on to join a lot of different high-profile McDonald's failures. I've got some up on the slides here. There's things like the McDLT, which was a quarter pounder where they put the lettuce and tomato in a separate compartment of a styrofoam tray so they wouldn't get hot with the burger and they taste fresh. I found this picture of the onion McNuggets now, or the onion nuggets. Now, I've never actually tried them. I imagine they probably taste about as good as they look, which is not very. I do remember hearing about the McDonald's pizza. I never got to try it. Actually, it came out in many different forms. They test marketed it in a lot of different places. And whatever the McDonald's pizza was, it was supposed to be awful. I never knew a single person that had tried it and liked it. That definitely became a high-profile failure, as you'd hear rumors about it. And then the McLean Deluxe that came out in the 1980s, and the McLean Deluxe was McDonald's attempt to offer a healthier burger with a burger patty that was made out of what many people assume was probably soy and not actually beef. Nobody was ever sure. McDonald's would deny that it was a soy burger, but then, you know, there were all kinds of urban legends to the contrary. It's hard to say. The Arch Deluxe, like all of these products, was a product that was intended to solve a problem that consumers didn't really have. I mean, it was a nice idea to try to extend the line of what McDonald's could do, but really, if McDonald's had been trying to solve the correct problem, they would have been trying to understand what their core values were and how they could stretch those core values to continue to capture more customers, rather than to try to introduce a product to compete with a problem that nobody really had. And in fact, McDonald's got a lot smarter after the Arch Deluxe, because they started focusing on value. They started focusing on speed. They started focusing on using a small range of products to serve a lot of needs at a very low price point, and they continue to do that to this day. And as it happened too, the Arch Deluxe did breed some good things. There were 3 other deluxe sandwiches that came out at the same time. McDonald's used this opportunity to improve the crispy chicken sandwich, the grilled chicken sandwich, and the filet of fish sandwich. So they introduced deluxe versions of all 3 of those, and those remained on the menu for quite a while, actually. So again, McDonald's solved the wrong problem and took the wrong action, and they had a very high-profile failure. And it wasn't until after that that they really understood that it was their values that mattered, not this fictional problem that they had come up with in their own minds. Well, the third thing I'm going to talk about is New York City crime. And this is not in your textbook, but there are 2 articles that you can read. They're both in your lecture notes and they're on the slides. And this is a complicated issue. I'm going to really simplify it, but I think it's interesting. And I think that it really relates to what we're talking about. So in the 1970s and 80s, even the late 1960s, there was a big problem in New York City and a lot of other cities with increasingly growing violent crime. And there were a lot of reasons that violent crime was said to be on the rise, but there wasn't really a lot of clarity on what was actually happening. There were a lot of theories. One of the theories, for example, was that crack cocaine had become an epidemic. Crack cocaine took an expensive street drug and repackaged it as a cheap street drug that could be sold in really poor communities, and it was also insanely addictive. So when people would get hooked on crack, they would tend to commit more crimes to try to continue to get more crack. That was one of the theories. And in New York City, crime was on the rise, and there was a theory that became very popular in New York as well as other large cities that was published in a magazine called The Atlantic in 1982. And the crux of the article was that fixing broken windows could help to reduce crime. And the idea was that if you go into a neighborhood where you see broken windows, you're going to assume that, you know, if you have buildings with broken windows, you're going to assume that nobody cares about that neighborhood, and that therefore it's okay to commit crimes there because nobody cares. If you go into a neighborhood and you see windows that aren't broken on otherwise decrepit buildings, you're going to assume that somebody cares enough to keep those windows fixed up, and therefore you're going to be on better behavior because you're going to know that somebody in that neighborhood cares. That's the idea of the broken window argument. And it was published in 1982 in The Atlantic, and then it was published later in the 1990s in this book that's also here on the slides by one of the authors of the original article. And that picture of the police officer there actually comes from the Atlantic original version of the story. And so the idea was that if police forces could encourage communities to spray paint and to fix broken windows and to just look like they were well kept, that crime would be low. And one person that really embraced this idea in New York City was a guy named Rudy Giuliani, who at the time in the 1990s when that book came out, was running for mayor. And Rudy Giuliani campaigned on an anti-crime platform and won. And one of the first things that he did was he put a guy named Bill Bratton from the Boston Police Department in charge as the police commissioner of the NYPD. And between Giuliani and Bratton, this fixing broken windows idea was applied, and they would do things like, for example, if subway buses got spray painted with graffiti, or subway cars, excuse me, would get spray painted with graffiti, they would bring them in, paint them down really quick with paint to cover the spray paint up, and then they would send them back out so that it would be as if it never happened. And the idea was, if we can show these criminals that we're, even if they deface our subway cars, that we're going to take care of it, that they're not going to want to be here in New York City. And as crazy as this might sound, crime did go down during the Giuliani mayorship. And, these 2 guys got a lot of credit for that, for these really aggressive tactics. Now, they did some other things as well. One of the things they implemented was a system called Crime Stat, which I'm going to talk about maybe later in this course. It's a completely different topic, very controversial topic too. But many of the things that they did and put into place, they got credit for reducing crime in the 1990s. The problem is, though, that not everybody thinks that they deserve credit. And there are a lot of theories about why they don't, and a lot of those theories suggest that what they did was just completely a placebo effect because crime was already going to be declining because of other factors that were going on in the environment. And that these actions that they were taking, that they received credit for, and in fact which police forces took and adapted to use in other places, sometimes with questionable effectiveness, the reason that these worked was because of a social trend that was going on. It had nothing to do with the police actions that were taking place. Now, one of the ideas, one of the more contentious ideas that you might have heard of, came from this book. It actually wasn't originally published in this book, but it was popularized by this book called Freakonomics. And Freakonomics was written by two gentlemen, one of whom is a New York Times reporter, and the other of whom is a economic professor from Chicago. And this economics professor, Stephen Levitt, had written a paper where he had looked at a bunch of data and realized that there was a link between crime rates and abortion rates. And this is really interesting. Now, I'm going to qualify this by saying, first of all, I'm not sure I agree with this theory. It's really interesting. I'm not sure I agree with it. And secondly, I'm not attempting to take any kind of political stance here. So whatever your feelings of abortion are, this is what Stephen Levitt had to say, not what Sean Jordan has to say, okay? But the idea was that in 1973, Roe versus Wade legalized abortion and to a large degree destigmatized abortion. It was, after that Supreme Court decision, legal to have abortions, and it was also getting to be a more socially acceptable thing because of that case, so high profile. And Levitt's theory argues that during that time, there were a number of women who would have had unwanted children who didn't. And because they didn't have those unwanted children often grew up in impoverished households, and they often grew up with a lack of parental supervision, and so they are more likely to become criminals. And because those children were never born and thus never lived to become criminals, that the crime rate went down naturally as the existing criminals aged or got put into jail or died or whatever, and there was nobody to rise up in the ranks to replace them. And that would have happened around the 1990s when these crime trends started to go down, because that's when those kids would have come of age in the wake of R v. Wade. So, interesting. It's an interesting idea. It's a very contentious idea, a very controversial idea, but again, it might be trying to solve the wrong problem, because the problem isn't necessarily about crime, and it isn't necessarily about abortion. In fact, those both might be symptoms. I became aware of this when I read this more recent article that appeared in Mother Jones magazine. Now, Mother Jones, just so you know, it's kind of a progressive, liberal, left-leaning magazine. I do think that they have excellent journalism. I think that they do a really good job on reporting factual information. They might have a bit of a slant, but they do a good job of verifying their sources. And they published an article citing a lot of research that was being done in what's called the lead theory. The lead theory actually is probably the most compelling argument I've seen for the rise and fall of crime in the United States, and particularly in cities, because the lead theory says that lead, which is an element that we used to have in our gasoline and which is very toxic to human beings and can make us behave erratically and violently, lead was something that very suddenly became an environmental problem, and then just as suddenly ceased to be an environmental problem because of the presence of gasoline. So it used to be that gasoline that was used in cars all had lead in it. And around the 1980s, we began to realize that was really bad for the human environment, particularly in cities, because it would put a lot of lead into the environment and get into things, and get into water, and get into paint, or it was already in paint, but it would get into things that would affect people. And as a result, it would cause all kinds of social problems. And so we realized that lead was not a good thing, and we took it out of the gasoline. That's why gasoline is now called unleaded. And the result of that was that there was less lead in the environment. And that would have really come into play around the 1990s. And so the lead theory suggests that just by the simple fact that we took lead out of the environment, people were less prone to violence. They were less prone to extreme behavior, and therefore the problem of crime began to go away naturally. And this is a really interesting perspective, because what this suggests is that all of the actions and all of the discussion around reducing crime really ignored what the root problem, what the root cause of crime might have been, and that might have been lead in the environment. And we just kind of coincidentally solved the problem because of other things that were pushing us that way. But it may have been that crime was a symptom and not the problem itself. And it may be that many of the law enforcement techniques that we credit today from the 1990s really had very little effect on crime, and it was really just a matter of improving the environment for everyone. Very interesting. Well, all of this should help you to understand that if we define a marketing research problem properly, our research is more likely to lead us towards the right conclusions, but if we define it improperly, our research is more likely to lead us to the wrong conclusions. And thus, it becomes really important to make sure that we are solving the right problem. We have to make sure that we dig deep enough to look beneath the symptoms, and that we're actually looking for a problem that doesn't have anything that's impacting it, that it's not dependent on anything else, that it's something that's at the root of what it is that we're trying to solve. And if we can really do our due diligence and make sure we understand the problem well, then we can also set an appropriate standard for action so that once we are done with our research, we know how to act, we know how to respond to what we've learned. Now I'm going to give you an 8-step process here. This is in your lecture notes. But the 8-step process is just how we define a problem. And this isn't in your textbook, but this is just something that, this is a logical process that you can follow when you're looking at how to define a problem. So let's start with step 1. Define the perceived problem in clear and specific terms. And when I say perceived problem, I mean whatever we think initially the problem is. So we might think that the problem initially is that our cola beverage doesn't taste as good as our competitor. That's our perceived problem. So let's write that down and define it as clearly as we can. And then we can conduct a situational analysis of the problem, and we can validate the symptoms of the problem. And those are tools that we can use to try to understand what's going on around the problem, what's impacting it, what's causing it, what's leading to perceptions of it. And we can see if the problem itself is a symptom of something deeper, or if there are symptoms that are being caused by the problem that we can identify. Once we know all of that, we can really narrow down what the probable cause of the problem is. And once we get to that, we can refine our problem definition to address what the actual cause is, rather than what we initially thought the problem was. Then, once we know the cause and we've refined our definition, we can determine what decision that we need to make. We can outline our action steps, which are the things that we're going to actually do once we have some information. And we can also try to think about the consequences of those actions that'll occur for each of our decision alternatives. And decision alternatives would be things like, if we learn X, then we're going to do this, and if we learn Y, then we're going to do that. So we can specify maybe 2 or 3 courses of action. And then finally, we can determine what information we need to know. And we're going to talk about setting research objectives in a future lecture, but that's what step 8 would lead to, is setting good research objectives. Now, action standards are really important, and we're going to talk about action standards more later, but I like to kind of think of action standards and problems as being related in such a way that we need to make sure we have both an action standard or action standards and a problem or problems to solve to make sure that our research project is going to be successful. So I made this little matrix for you. And if we don't have a problem and we don't have any action standards, then any research that we're going to do is going to be nice to know. It's nice to know, but it's not need to know. If we have a problem to solve but we don't set any action standards for it, we're going to get some data that's going to help us to see the problem, but we're not going to know what to do with all that data. If we set action standards but we don't really have a problem to solve, if we're really just addressing a symptom, or if we have a really vague idea of what the problem is, we can say, I see you say what I need to do, but I don't understand why I need to do it. So in other words, we can set action without giving a firm argument for why that action needs to be taken, and that's not a good idea. That's a real waste of research. Finally, if we do have a problem to solve and we do have action standards in place, we can say, this gives me a clear plan of action towards a problem I need to solve. And that's ultimately where we want to be with any research that we conduct. So in defining the problem, we need to be sure that we get down to the root cause. We need to really clearly understand what it is that we're trying to learn, and then we need to know how we're going to act on that problem in order to be able to maximize the value of the research that we've conducted. Well, thank you for making it through this section of the lecture. I hope it's been interesting to you. And we're going to talk next a little bit more deeply about problem sources and symptoms of problems. As we begin to wind down this lecture series, and hopefully some shorter lectures, I want you to really think carefully about, how often do we identify symptoms as being the problems when we really aren't thinking deeply enough about what's causing those symptoms to happen? It happens a lot more often than we like to admit, and much of the time the action that we take is pretty futile because we're addressing symptoms that are just going to arise once again down the road, rather than really figuring out how we can keep those symptoms from occurring in the first place.